The night was cold, the kind of cold that bites at the skin and makes every breath feel like knives in the chest. Out in the black waters of San Francisco Bay, waves crashed against jagged rocks, the sound swallowed by a howling wind. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 men paddled desperately on a makeshift raft, homemade from raincoats and stolen wood. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. Names etched forever into the legend of Alcatraz. But here's the mystery. After that night in June 1962, they vanished. No bodies were ever recovered. No proof they drowned. No proof they lived. Just silence. And for more than half a century, that silence has fueled one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Did they die in the bay? Or did they pull off the impossible and vanish into freedom? What happened on that night would shock the nation. And what was discovered years later would change everything. Frank Lee Morris was not the kind of man you'd expect to become a household name. Born into poverty in Washington, D.C., abandoned by his parents at a young age, Morris bounced between foster homes and reform schools. He was small in stature, sharp-eyed, and quiet, qualities that made him easy to overlook. But inside his mind was something different, an intelligence that cut like a razor. By the time he was in his 30s, Frank had been convicted of armed robbery and repeated prison breaks. Wherever he was locked up, he always looked for weaknesses, always looked for doors others didn't see. And that's why, when he was transferred to Alcatraz, the escape-proof prison, officials believed they had finally beaten him. Alcatraz sat like a fortress in the middle of the bay. From the prison yard, inmates could see San Francisco, gleaming across the water, so close, yet impossible to reach. The air was always damp with salt. The stench of mildew clung to the cell blocks. Guards' footsteps echoed on the catwalks at night like drumbeats in a military march. Every detail was designed to crush hope. But Frank wasn't like the others. He saw possibilities where others saw walls. And he wasn't alone. It began quietly. Inmates noticed Frank spending more time with 2 brothers from Florida, John and Clarence Anglin. Like Frank, they had a history of robberies, breakouts, and clever thinking. They also shared something else, an obsession with freedom. At first, it was small things. Frank asking about the thickness of the walls. John staring a little too long at the ventilation grates above his bunk. Clarence carving soap into strange shapes that looked almost human. Guards dismissed it as boredom. Inmates whispered about something bigger, but no one said it out loud, because saying it meant believing the impossible, that someone could break out of Alcatraz. One night, a guard paused near Frank's cell. He thought he heard scratching, like nails against concrete. "Keep it down in there, Morris," the guard barked. Frank looked up, calm, unreadable. "Just a mouse, boss. They're everywhere." The guard frowned, listening again. The scratching stopped. What the guard didn't know was that Frank had been working for weeks, using a stolen spoon and a homemade drill fashioned from a motor taken from a prison vacuum cleaner. Each night, he chipped away at the concrete around the vent behind his sink, hiding the hole with painted cardboard during the day. Meanwhile, Clarence perfected his soap heads, mixing prison soap with toilet paper and hair gathered from the barber shop. The faces looked disturbingly real, with painted eyes that glistened in the low light. And John? He'd figured out how to piece together a raft, using over 50 raincoats stolen from the prison laundry. Each man played his role. Each man kept the secret. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. A fellow inmate, Alan West, began asking questions. "What are you guys always working on?" he muttered one night, his eyes narrowed. Frank shot him a look. "Mind your own cell, West." But West wasn't just curious, he was part of the plan. And Frank knew that if West faltered, if he got scared, everything would collapse. Still, Frank allowed him in. Because in a place like Alcatraz, you couldn't afford to make enemies. The pieces were coming together, but time was running out. The guards were getting suspicious, and one mistake could mean months in solitary, or worse. By May 1962, the men had carved through their vents and climbed into an unguarded utility corridor behind the cell block. From there, they discovered something no guard ever wanted them to see: a hidden pathway to the roof. It smelled of dust and old concrete. The air was thick with mildew, and the narrow passage echoed with every movement. Frank ran his hands along the walls, whispering, "This is it. This is the way out." For the first time, escape wasn't just an idea. It was real, tangible. The danger was no longer about being caught dreaming. It was about being caught in the act. June 11th, 1962. The night everything changed. In the dark, Frank, John, and Clarence placed the dummy heads in their beds. So lifelike that from a guard's flashlight, they looked like sleeping men. Quietly, they slipped through their holes and into the corridor. But Alan West wasn't with them. His hole wasn't big enough. He struggled, panicked, scraping at the concrete with bleeding fingers. Frank hissed back at him, "Come on!" "I can't." West whispered, voice breaking. "It's stuck." Time was running out. The brothers looked at Frank. Frank looked back. And in that silent moment, a decision was made. They left him. For Alan West, Alcatraz would remain a cage. For Frank and the Anglin brothers, the night was just beginning. They climbed the utility pipes, broke onto the roof, and slipped down a kitchen vent. Every shadow felt like a spotlight. Every creak of the prison seemed deafening. Finally, they reached the shoreline. The water was black, churning, freezing cold. The raft waited. Clarence whispered, "We'll never make it." Frank's eyes burned with determination. "We don't die in here. Not tonight." They pushed into the bay, paddling with stolen oars, disappearing into the darkness. Behind them, Alcatraz stood silent, the guards oblivious to the ghosts slipping from its grip. Morning came. Guards walked the cell block. One tapped his flashlight against Frank's bunk. "Wake up, Morris." No movement. He tapped harder. The head rolled to the floor, shattering on impact. Soap, paper, paint. The guard's scream echoed through the prison. Within minutes, alarms blared. Sirens wailed. Helicopters swept the bay. But there was nothing. No raft. No bodies. Just empty water. And 3 missing men. For decades, the official story was that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned that night. The government insisted it. The FBI closed the case. But then, years later, photographs surfaced. Letters emerged. And a shocking confession would suggest the unthinkable. That the men who vanished from Alcatraz may have lived. And the truth of what happened after that night is far darker than anyone imagined. The morning after June 11th, 1962, the most secure prison in America was in chaos. Guards ran up and down the tiers, sirens blared, and searchlights swept across the dark waters of San Francisco Bay. 3 men were missing: Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. They had slipped through the cracks of the escape-proof prison. And in doing so, they challenged the authority of the United States government. But the question remained: were they swallowed by the icy waters of the bay? Or did they succeed in one of the most daring prison breaks in American history? The official search would turn up nothing. But what surfaced years later, letters, photographs, eyewitnesses, would suggest something far more shocking. For weeks, the FBI and US Marshals scoured every inch of San Francisco Bay. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats dragged the waters. Coast Guard divers plunged into the freezing depths. Nothing. All they found were pieces of a paddle and scraps of rubber believed to be from the raft. But no bodies, no clothing, no bones. And yet, the bay was unforgiving. The water, often 50 degrees Fahrenheit, could cause hypothermia in minutes. The current was vicious, pulling everything toward the Golden Gate Bridge and out into the Pacific. Officials clung to one narrative: they drowned. But not everyone was convinced. Alan West, the inmate left behind, told investigators everything. How he, Morris, and the Anglin brothers had planned the escape for months. How they built the raft, the dummies, the drills. But when asked the most important question, did he think they survived? West hesitated. They were strong, he said softly. Stronger than most think. His words hung in the air like smoke. The government dismissed them, but others listened. In the years that followed, strange things began to surface. 1965, 3 years after the escape, the Anglin family received a Christmas card. Inside was a simple message written in shaky handwriting. Merry Christmas, from John and Clarence. The FBI dismissed it as a hoax, but the family swore it was their handwriting. 1967. A man in Brazil claimed to have seen 2 Americans living in a small farm town. They looked like the Anglin brothers, he said. Quiet, reclusive. When US authorities followed the lead, they arrived too late. The men were gone. 1973. A woman swore she saw Frank Morris in South Carolina, walking into a local bar. She described his piercing eyes, his small frame, but no one could prove it. The trail was always just one step ahead. The Anglin family refused to believe the brothers had drowned. We never buried them, their sister Marie said, because we never had bodies. I believe they made it. I believe they lived. And in the years to come, the family began receiving more than just cards. They received photographs. In the late 1970s, the family was shown a grainy Polaroid. 2 men in sunglasses sat on a porch in Brazil, their faces aged but familiar. The jawlines, the hairlines. The Anglin family swore it was John and Clarence. The FBI studied it. They admitted the resemblance was uncanny, but still, they called it inconclusive. But for the Anglins, it wasn't inconclusive at all. It was proof. Then, in 2013, over 50 years after the escape, a letter arrived at a San Francisco police station. It was written in a shaky hand. The words were chilling. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. Yes, we all made it that night. But barely. I'm 83 years old now. I have cancer. This is no joke. The letter went on to say that Frank had died in 2008. Clarence had died in 2011. And that John himself was tired of running. But the letter ended with a haunting plea. If you announce on TV that I'll get medical treatment and not be arrested, I'll tell you exactly where I am. This is the truth. The FBI tested the letter, the handwriting, the DNA, the fingerprints. The results? Inconclusive. Investigators now faced a terrifying question. If the letter was real, it meant the United States government had lied for decades. Lied to the public. Lied to the world. For years, they claimed the men had drowned. But what if, instead, they had slipped away under the cover of night, lived full lives, and watched their story turn into legend, while the government pretended otherwise? An FBI agent who worked the case admitted years later, if they did survive, then the system failed. Alcatraz wasn't supposed to fail. That's why the truth may never be fully told. To this day, the FBI lists the case as closed. Officially, the men are presumed dead. But U.S. Marshals, the only agency that never gave up, still keep active files, still chase down leads, still knock on doors in faraway countries, searching for shadows of 3 men who disappeared into the night. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, ghosts who refused to rest. And then, just when the mystery seemed buried in history, a new discovery would surface. Something buried deep in FBI archives. Something so shocking, so well hidden, that it could finally expose the truth of what happened to the escapees of Alcatraz. But what was uncovered wasn't just about whether the men lived. It was about what they did after. For over 50 years, the world believed the escape from Alcatraz was either a tragic drowning or a miraculous success story. But then, hidden documents surfaced. Documents the FBI never meant for the public to see. What they revealed was darker than anyone imagined. Because if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived the icy waters of the bay, their story didn't end with freedom. It may have only just begun. In the late 1990s, a retired U.S. Marshal named Michael Dyke was combing through old case files. He had spent years chasing rumors of the escapees: Brazil, Mexico, Florida, even Cuba. But buried in a box of yellowed papers, he found something strange: internal memos marked classified. Notes suggesting that U.S. intelligence agencies, not just law enforcement, had been tracking the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris long after 1962. The memos were stamped with dates stretching into the 1980s and even the 1990s. If true, it meant the government had evidence the men were alive, and they kept it hidden. One memo described a 1975 bank robbery in rural Georgia. Witnesses claimed the robbers were 2 older white males who looked strikingly like John and Clarence Anglin. Another file detailed a sighting in Paraguay. A CIA informant had provided photographs: 2 men walking down a dirt road, their faces partially obscured by hats. The FBI dismissed these leads, but the memos suggested otherwise, that behind closed doors, the government wasn't dismissing them at all. In 1982, a Florida sheriff's deputy responded to a routine burglary call. The suspects fled, leaving behind fingerprints on a broken window pane. Those prints were quietly forwarded to federal authorities. And according to the memo Dyke read, the analysis was chilling: high probability match to Clarence Anglin. But nothing was ever made public. The burglary was written off as unsolved. Why hide it? Why bury the evidence? Unless the truth was more dangerous than the legend. The memos hinted at a phrase repeated several times: asset viability. Why would prison escapees be referred to as assets? Unless they weren't just fugitives, but something more, something useful. In 2005, Dyke tracked down an aging law enforcement officer who had once worked with the Marshals on the Alcatraz case. When Dyke mentioned Frank Morris, the officer went pale. "You don't want to go down that road," the man muttered. "If you knew what happened after, you'd wish they had drowned in that bay." He refused to say more, but his warning left Dyke shaken. What could possibly be worse than decades of living as fugitives? Then came the bombshell. A declassified photograph dated 1978, taken in South America. 3 men sitting outside a small cafe. Their faces aged but unmistakable: Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. But what stood out wasn't just their presence. It was the men sitting with them. Armed men. Soldiers. The escapees of Alcatraz weren't just living quietly. They were surrounded by a paramilitary group. Dyke stared at the photograph for hours. If it was authentic, it meant the escapees may have joined, or been forced into, something much larger than themselves. Smuggling, mercenary work, intelligence operations. And suddenly, the pieces began to fit. The memos, the secrecy, the references to assets. These weren't just criminals on the run. They were men caught in the shadowy world of Cold War espionage. Had the US government looked the other way because the men were useful? The deeper Dyke dug, the more resistance he faced. Doors slammed. Records disappeared. It was as though someone wanted the mystery of Alcatraz to remain a mystery. Because the truth wasn't just about whether the men lived or died. It was about what they became. And then, Dyke uncovered something that chilled him to his core. A final memo, dated 1986. Short, direct, stamped with a red warning, eyes only. It contained just 7 words. Morris and Anglin, operation complete. Assets secured. But what was the operation? What did it mean to call the men secured? And most terrifying of all, did it mean they were still alive and being held somewhere in secret? For decades, the world wondered if the men who vanished from Alcatraz drowned in the bay or reached freedom. But what investigators uncovered in hidden government files suggests a far darker possibility. That Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin didn't just escape, they were taken. And what happened to them afterward may rewrite everything we thought we knew about the unsolved Alcatraz escape. In 2011, nearly 50 years after the escape, US Marshal Michael Dyke sat in a dimly lit archive room, staring at that final memo from 1986. Morris and Anglin, operation complete. Assets secured. The words rattled him. They weren't the language of law enforcement. They were the language of intelligence. And buried in the folder was a second, smaller note, an address. A rural compound outside of Huntsville, Texas. It was here that Dyke believed the truth might finally be uncovered. Dyke made the drive himself. The compound was heavily fenced, with a long dirt road leading to a cluster of low, windowless buildings. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust. He parked at a distance and watched. Men in plain clothes came and went. No signs, no logos, just silence. It didn't look like a prison, but it didn't look free, either. That night, Dyke checked local records. Officially, the compound didn't exist. No landowner filings, no tax records, no government contracts. It was a ghost facility. The only trace he found was a brief mention in an old Department of Justice report, Special Detention Program, Huntsville Sector. The program had no description, no details, just a name, and one phrase that sent chills down Dyke's spine. Long-term holding of non-standard assets. If the escapees had been captured and classified as non-standard assets, then the question wasn't whether they drowned or lived. It was whether they'd been imprisoned again, in secret. And if so, for what purpose? In 2013, Dyke spoke with a retired corrections officer who had worked briefly in Huntsville in the late 1970s. When Dyke mentioned Alcatraz, the man froze. His eyes darted, his hands trembled. "You don't know what you're asking," the officer muttered. "But I'll tell you this. There were 3 men there, older than the records said they should be. Kept separate, watched day and night. Everyone was told never to use their names, only numbers." He lowered his voice. "And one of them, he had the coldest eyes I've ever seen." The officer described something even more disturbing. He claimed the men were periodically escorted out of the compound, loaded into unmarked vans, and returned days later, exhausted, bruised, and silent. No one knew where they were taken. No one dared to ask. When Dyke pressed him for details, the man whispered one final sentence. They weren't prisoners. They were tools. Dyke struggled with what he had learned. If true, it meant the Alcatraz escapees were not fugitives hiding in South America or farmhouses. They had been captured, controlled, and used. Used for what? Smuggling? Espionage? Assassinations? Every possibility was darker than the last, and the silence of official agencies only deepened the suspicion. The more Dyke searched, the more resistance he faced. His requests for files were denied. Old colleagues stopped returning his calls. Finally, an anonymous envelope arrived at his office. Inside was a single black and white photograph. 3 men sitting at a table in what looked like a military facility. Their faces older, harder, but unmistakable. Frank, John, Clarence. On the back, scribbled in pencil, were 2 words. Still here. But that wasn't the most chilling part, because tucked behind the photograph was a second note. No signature, no date, just 6 words. You're getting too close. Stop now. And for Dyke, that raised a terrifying question. If the men from Alcatraz were still here, where were they now? For over half a century, the fate of the 3 men who escaped from Alcatraz, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, remained one of America's greatest mysteries. Were they free men living in secret? Were they government assets held in shadow prisons? Or did they die, swallowed by the dark waters of San Francisco Bay that night in June 1962? After years of digging, U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke believed he had finally come close to the truth. But the truth he uncovered was not just about Alcatraz. It was about the choices we make, the price of freedom, and the haunting reality that not all escapes lead to liberation. Dyke sat alone in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting shadows over piles of documents. The anonymous note still burned in his mind. You're getting too close. Stop now. But stopping had never been in his nature. Like the men he hunted, Dyke carried his own stubborn will to keep pushing against impossible walls. He decided to make one final trip, back to San Francisco, back to the Rock. If the answers lay anywhere, they would be in the place where it all began. On a foggy morning, Dyke boarded the tourist ferry to Alcatraz. The bay was cold, the waves restless. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed in the distance, its towers half hidden in mist. He walked the prison's silent halls, now filled with tourists instead of guards and inmates. He passed cell Block B, pausing at the very cells once occupied by Morris and the Anglin brothers. Visitors laughed and took photographs. But Dyke wasn't looking at the prison as a museum. He was looking at it as a crime scene, a puzzle, a scar. And as he stood there, a question echoed in his mind. Did they regret it? The closer Dyke looked, the more he realized the prison itself held clues. The vent holes, the painted dummies, the roof. Everything had been designed for one purpose: to get out. But freedom is never just about escape. Freedom is about what comes after. And that's when Dyke thought about the photograph. The men, aged, sitting in a secret compound. Were they free, or had they only traded one prison for another? Later that evening, Dyke met with the Anglin family in Florida. Their sister Marie, now frail and elderly, held his hand tightly. "I know they lived," she whispered. "I know it. But living isn't the same as being free." She showed Dyke a final letter she had kept hidden. It was unsigned, undated, written in shaky handwriting. The words were heartbreaking. "We got what we wanted, but we lost more than we gained. Tell people this. Freedom is not just leaving a place. Freedom is knowing peace in your heart. And I never found it." For Dyke, that was the truth. Yes, the men had escaped Alcatraz. Yes, there was evidence they survived. But survival came at a cost. They lived as shadows, never able to come home, never able to rest, always looking over their shoulders. They had beaten Alcatraz, but they had not beaten themselves. And perhaps, in the end, they had built a different kind of prison, one without bars, but with walls of fear, exile, and regret. Standing before the family, Dyke finally said the words that had haunted him. They didn't drown in that bay, but they didn't live free either. And maybe that's the real lesson of Alcatraz. Marie nodded, tears in her eyes. They wanted escape, she said, but what they needed was redemption. The case remains officially unsolved. The US Marshals still keep the files open. But for Dyke, and for the Anglin family, the truth was enough. Not a neat ending, not a perfect victory, but a reminder that freedom without peace is only another kind of prison. The escape from Alcatraz was not just about 3 men defying the impossible. It was about the choices we all face. We can run from our problems. We can carve through walls, paddle into dark waters, and vanish into the night. But if we don't face what's inside of us, if we don't find peace within, then no escape will ever set us free. As one quote says, "He who opens a door of escape must first close the door within himself." And another, true freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of peace. The story of Alcatraz is a mystery, but it's also a mirror, a reminder that our greatest prisons are not made of stone and steel. They are made of fear, regret, and the choices we carry. And escaping them requires more than courage. It requires wisdom. We cannot always choose the walls around us, but we can choose the walls within us. And when we choose to live with integrity, forgiveness, and peace, then no prison, no circumstance, no hardship can hold us.
And you don't want to miss what comes next. So before you go, subscribe now, like this video, and click the bell. Because the next case might just hold the answer to the one you can't stop thinking about. Join the investigation. Join us behind the crime.